Well, hope everyone's having a great day. It is time for the third edition, our third go around on the next Big Thing podcast. I am Chris Gennady, Global Head of Research at WisdomTree. We've got an exciting topic today, renewable energy, the energy transition. I'm going to be joined by an expert from Wood Mackenzie, Adam Woods. So coincidental name overlap there. Last name of person and name of firm. But before we start, we have to go through our required disclaimer. I do need to state the following. To clarify, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of WisdomTree and Wood Mackenzie and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. So, with that said, as we always like to get started with all of our guests, I would love for Adam Woods from Wood Mackenzie to be able to both introduce himself, his background, as well as the firm. So first and foremost, we get to know him a little bit. Adam, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for having me. Like you said, my name's Adam Woods. I'm a senior research analyst at Wood Mackenzie. For those not familiar, Wood Mackenzie is a leader in the power and renewables and commodity research and consultancy space. So over the past few years, I've had the pleasure of acting as a bit of a liaison between our multiple analysts across and research experts across a variety of renewable and commodity spaces, and kind of bringing those insights and those forecasts forward to WisdomTree and helping them kind of shape their strategy. So that's been a great journey over the past few years. A little bit about Wood Mackenzie. So we're a global company, and so we have dozens of teams covering multiple different spaces. So I've gotten the opportunity to speak to them all individually and look through our forecasts and kind of talk through some of that today. A bit on my background, I'm actually more focused on thermal coal research in North America and Europe. And if you're not familiar with that, thermal coal is coal for power generation. And so that's been an extremely interesting space over the past few years. We're kind of at the tail end of what I would consider a super cycle, kind of backed by some geopolitical tensions that we're all aware of over the past few years, have kind of thrown markets into a frenzy. So I've had a front row seat into seeing how fossil fuels have been interacting and competing with each other along with power and renewables. So really interesting space to be in right now.
And it's interesting that, we say at the top, the topic is renewable energy. The topic is the energy transition. And yet we're talking about coal, sort of almost the black sheep of the energy space. Everybody is quick to note the pollutant elements as relate to coal. And yet at the same time, you always hear such and such country is needing power, which is always the case. We always need more energy. We're consuming more data. Things like generative AI are happening, and they certainly never require less power. And if it's harder to get the natural gas for various reasons or other energy sources, maybe the wind's not blowing, the sun isn't shining, or at least as intently. So what do you use? You use coal. So Adam, I'm just curious, like, are we trying as a society to go to a zero use policy for coal, or is that really just a pipe dream? And we talk about stuff like that, but in reality, 10 years from now, do you sort of think we're still going to be using coal in various ways?
Yeah, I think the key word there is who's the we in this situation. If we're looking at the U.S., yeah, there's a strong move towards the decarbonization right now. There's a lot of retirements based off of economics, based off of decarbonization efforts. And so within the next 10 years, we are going to see a pretty rapid decline for U.S. thermal coal generation. That's going to be offset obviously by renewables and kind of some very steady gas demand going forward. Europe is also going to be a leader in decarbonization. Aside from the past 2 years where they did bring on some more capacity we did see a boost in coal generation because of the lack of um, gas supply. We had some issues with the renewable and nuclear space. We did see a bit of a resurgence in coal, but their long-term policy, they are committed to decarbonizing, and coal will be the first to go in those Western economies. But when you think globally, coal is going to remain in pretty high demand. We have not even seen peak coal demand yet. So when you think about developing economies, we're going to think some African countries, Asian countries, still very reliant on coal and coal power going forward.
And when these more developing regions are using coal, because frequently when we talk about oil, or we'll talk later in this podcast about certain metals, and what you tend to learn is whatever you're talking about is usually sourced from a specific region. It's not as though, or at least it doesn't seem like every country, every region has sort of an equal supply of every necessary commodity. So there's always sort of that central supplier with most of the supply, and then they're sending it to all these other regions. So when we're talking about coal, is it the case that if you're a country in Africa, you're able to source your own coal? So if you're using coal, you're energy independent? Or is it a case where China, which has a lot of coal, is sending, and it's sort of a way in which China is sort of creating that dependency and that sort of central place in the global economy?
Yeah, it's a pretty nuanced market. So you think about a few different major hubs in the international coal trade. U.S. is a more of a swing supplier. You want to think more about Australia, Indonesia, and South Africa. The most sustainable ones are going to be the U.S., Australia, South Africa buying and producing their own coal. Um, China doesn't export much; they produce a ton. It's not a very high quality coal, so when they're interested in a more high quality product, that's when they're looking towards Australia. If they're looking for lesser quality product for a bit cheaper, that's when they're looking at Indonesia. And so each economy is going to have to kind of do that cost benefit analysis. If you think about African countries, the infrastructure for sending coal north from South Africa isn't very robust. So it's actually easier in some cases to buy Indonesian coal or Australian coal and import it directly to the coast, as opposed to depending on rail infrastructure. So I wouldn't say that generally the coal market is very localized. There are obviously smaller players, but generally the ones that we see buying coal through the long term are going to be dependent on imported coal.
Excellent. Well, we learned everyone. We learned a bit about coal today. I bet when you dialed in, you weren't necessarily expecting that. But as we now shift gears and think a bit more about the energy transition, and less where we've been and more where we're trying to go, the first thing that we need to discuss is the Inflation Reduction Act, because essentially it's changing the game globally, because the U.S. is such a major player, and a lot of different incentives by way of money and abatements and various things are part of that very important legislation. So Adam, I'd love for you to just set the stage of some of the key, most important underlying components that you and Wood Mackenzie see when you're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act today.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole podcast just on the IRA. It's going
Yes.
to be a massive impact, billions upon billions of dollars of investment flooding into this market. And so the key ones that I'm probably the closest to are going to be the development of renewable projects and the incentives there, um, the incentives around renewable equipment manufacturing, kind of that midstream feed into the final development of a renewable project. And then also, I'm pretty close to the battery side. So we think about how we're going to incentivize domestic manufacturing, domestic sourcing, or rather sourcing of materials from free trade partners, and how that will work going forward. And so we can kind of dive into either side of that, depending on which way you want to go with this, Chris. Either the,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, I think the first thing that I feel like you hear a lot about is solar and wind, in the sense that it seems like there was already a lot of interest. These are similar to how the electric vehicle seems to be the thing that is just being adopted almost seemingly universally, where you rarely hear, if ever, that electric vehicles are a bad idea. You rarely hear a problem with wind power. You rarely hear these days, anyway, a problem with solar power. But some of the other sources of power, be it hydro, be it nuclear, it can be a bit more of a debate potentially. So what is it in your view and Wood Mackenzie's view about, say, solar and wind that has led to just such a high degree of interest and a build out and a focus in that particular area?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of reasons. You know that there's already a lot of technological advancement. They have a jump start on some of these. We think that there's a lot of cost savings involved, and we're going to see a lot of economies of scale going forward. And just to kind of step back, we're seeing a massive potential for solar and wind. We're looking at 90% renewables by 2050 as a doable thing that we're forecasting right now. And solar is going to be the biggest part of that, and wind as well. And so what the IRA is going to do is obviously it's going to incentivize. We have these credits for developing these projects, but what we're going to be able to see is reaping the benefits kind of twofold. Is that we're going to see credits on the manufacturing of these components, and then that is going to be passed on to the developers, and we're also going to see the credits there on the development side of of purchasing um, these these components. And so a few of the pieces that kind of fit into this solar and wind picture within the IRA is what's feasible to be done to reap the full benefits of the IRA. And there's a certain, and kind of step in to a tangent, and China has a huge control over a few of these componentry markets. And so the IRA obviously isn't going to provide any incentive to Chinese manufactured components. And so there's this huge push towards investment within the US. Some of the labor intensive componentries, like PV panels for solar or the wind turbine blades, um, those we don't see those being so cost competitive, but the smaller nuts and bolts that go into a project right now are going to be feasible to produce domestically and feed into this growth story that we see for wind and solar. It's going to be a massive accelerant for that growth. The IRA is.
I want to dig into that a little because, Adam, I have to admit, I didn't realize that the story that I always hear in sort of the energy transition is China does a lot of the processing for the different battery metals. So sort of these things are coming out of the ground. They need to be processed into a certain form, and when they're in that form, then they can ultimately be used as whether it's the electrolyte or the cathode or the anode, and the battery makers. And it's interesting how the battery industry is so geographically dispersed in that you're getting the metals from one area, they're going to China, then they're going to all these other regions. And the statistic that always sticks in my mind is as the metal in the battery is in the car as you're driving it off the lot, that metal has potentially circled the earth a couple of times in terms of the amount of miles that it's had to travel. So obviously you see the world trying to adjust, let's say, the supply chain, maybe to be less reliant on China. Maybe you can't take that to zero, but ultimately, less reliance on China seems to be what you tend to hear if you're within U.S. borders, as we both are these days. But stepping back, we were talking about wind and solar, and what you said made it sound like there are also specific parts of the wind turbine, specific parts of the photovoltaic cell that are also dependent on China and not necessarily transitioned and in terms of the supply chain into the U.S. So do I have that right? And ultimately, we're not only thinking about batteries, maybe batteries and semiconductors get all the attention, but in solar and wind power, there are also specific things that China has dominated as well.
Certainly, especially on the PV panel side. And a big part of it is going to be kind of the head start on manufacturing they have, the economies of scale that they're realizing, the labor costs that go into these labor intensive pieces of a development project, and that's where they have those advantages, especially on the PVs. But yeah, that's they definitely have quite a large market share on that, and that's something that the whole IRA is trying to incentivize, like diversification, localization of this manufacturing process.
And something else that I saw, earlier this week in Financial Times, but you've seen it in Wall Street Journal, you've seen it in New York Times, you've seen it pretty much every big publication. Is everybody knows that billions of dollars are being allocated in all sorts of different ways. You're seeing certain investments, but there seems like there's a whole chain of activity that needs to take place prior to the, say, wind farm or solar farm actually going into operation and piping that energy or wiring that energy into the grid. And what's interesting is you hear a lot about the queue of these projects because as a layman, I'm looking at it, seeing it, and saying, "Huh, like it doesn't seem as though you just put the photovoltaic cells up or you put the turbines up and you take the wire and you connect it to the grid. It doesn't seem like it's anywhere near that simple. It seems like connecting sort of these new sources of power into a grid, and maybe it's in the US case, maybe it's different in every state or every county, um, built at a different time, maybe some different underlying infrastructure and technology. So at the end of the day, people are talking a lot about the grid not necessarily being up to the task or up to the goal that we have of bringing this much renewable energy online. And then additionally, people saying that everybody focuses on building more wind farms, building more solar farms, but people tend to focus a lot less on upgrading the grid. And how do you see the hopefully equation, let's say, balancing itself and getting to that point, similar to with EVs, where without the charging stations, it doesn't matter if everyone's buying EVs, we're going to have a problem. It sounds like here, without the grid being ready, it doesn't matter how cool all these renewable sources ultimately are going to be.
Yeah, completely. And so the interconnection and transmission issue is huge. That is one of the analysts' biggest gripes with the IRA. We have all these incentives for more renewables, more renewable manufacturing, but like you said, that is the biggest barrier to getting them connected to the grid. And so we have this variable power that essentially needs to be used or stored immediately. And with these localized interconnection pathways and transmission pathways, it limits the end user that a renewable project can reach. And so we need to see that grow. And I mean, we have a few views, but the picture to how to fix that is what a lot of people are working on right now. At least we hope, right? Um, and so I think one of them is it's going to have to be policy reform. This queue to come online, this big ask of bolstering the grid and getting more connection across the U.S. is going to be a big undertaking. And so the permitting process has to be reformed. There's ideas of grouping development projects together instead of approving one at a time, regionally grouping and saying, okay, we have a group that can all be processed at once. They're immediately connected to the grid. Another big one with the transmission side and how we spread out our power um, is going to be sort of we have these local ISOs, the regional governing bodies on this power distribution, and so if we can get more collaboration, looser guidelines, and get our grid nationalized, that's the goal here. I think another really big kind of release valve or help to this issue is going to be the build out of storage as well. I mean, this power is variable on the fact that it needs to be used immediately or stored immediately. So the more we build out our grid scale storage, the more and more flexible um, that power, that renewable power is going to be. So it's a bit of an issue though, because if we have this issue with we can't bring a slew of projects online because there's a big wait to do that. And then, well, if these projects aren't coming online, then we don't need the storage options. So it's like chicken and the egg, a bit of situation, in the fact that they both need to happen simultaneously. So that's definitely a huge barrier. But I think that policy reform and kind of a more robust storage infrastructure is going to be a big help to that.
Now, I've read a bit about the grid scale storage, and it's fascinating. What I find fascinating is just how different when you're thinking of, say, because you've got to deal with the fact that people use different amounts of power at different times of the day. So obviously, if you're and many of the articles cite, well, most people charge their electric vehicle at night, and there are a lot of benefits to that in the sense that the plug's right there in the garage, the power overnight when there's less demand because everybody's sleeping, it costs less. Whereas obviously in the evening when everyone's at home and streaming their favorite Netflix program, they're using more power, they're cooking dinner, the power is going to cost more. So the cost of the power and the demand for the power is always changing. And yet we know that if we're talking about a solar plant, the sun is not shining during the night. If we're talking about a wind farm, the wind may not blow 100% of the time. And so when you're trying to store massive amounts of power in the megawatt, gigawatt, possibly even terawatt type level, it's very different than say the nickel manganese cobalt battery, for instance, that sits in the Tesla and can accelerate the vehicle from 0 to 60 in like 1.5 seconds or whatever the case may be. So, Adam, I'd love to hear you just talk a bit about what Wood Mackenzie is seeing in the grid scale storage space. It's a very interesting space. And if we get it right, it's going to give, I think, a lot of flexibility to the types of renewable energy that you can bring online.
Definitely. And you mentioned that it's a different animal than that battery that's in your Tesla, but kind of at the same time, it's really not too different. We're still entirely dependent on lithium ion technology. That's what we're using, whether it's our cell phone or car or this battery that's going to power a small city, right? I think one piece that we're kind of taking a look at right now is what we would consider um, storage as a transmission asset and not just a generation asset. You think that a grid scale storage facility buys power cheap, sells it during a peak time. Um, and so they're essentially a generator. And so they're going to reap the benefits of tax credits and other benefits to the IRA as a generator. But if they were, and the wording isn't quite clear on this, but if they were able to reap the benefits as also a transmission asset, something that is used to spread power around, that could bring down the cost and incentivize even more grid scale storage and kind of boost our story and our capacity build out forecast. So that's a really interesting one to kind of think about. That it really is a twofold thing. It's a generator and a transmitter of power. And so if it is able to reap benefits through the IRA as such, that's going to be huge.
I just also want to recognize that, of course, we have listeners all over the globe. The IRA is, of course, a U.S. policy, a U.S. Legislation. But in the power space, you might see, and Wood Mackenzie might see, interesting things going on in the European market. I know some of the stories that I see, and I'm by no means an expert, are how, for example, the French market, which is heavily dominated by nuclear, has been sort of refurbishing some of the plants or sort of bringing them up to speed and doing safety checks. And as a result, maybe in the past they were able to maybe sell some of the power to other countries, and maybe in recent times that's been a bit less. But just curious in terms of what we're seeing in Europe and whether Europe is sort of pursuing wind and solar to say the same degree as we might be seeing in the US, or if they're also bringing in other renewable sources that maybe the US isn't as focused on.
Yeah, I think wind and solar are still going to dominate in Europe. That's kind of the story that we're seeing right now. I think that Europe may be a little bit more progressed in their wind manufacturing and the kind of a capture of a localized value chain than the U.S. is. Um, One thing that Europe is excelling at that would be a huge growth area for the U.S. Is offshore wind. That's something that they're kind of becoming the global expert in, which is has a like across all renewables within Europe has a massive growth story, but that's something that they really excel at. It is that offshore wind, as well as onshore wind. Um, but I would say that their growth story for renewables is even a bit more accelerated than the U.S. is.
I was living in London for a period, and I remember sometimes if there's no cloud cover and you're flying back over the channel, um, depending on the route that they take, you look out the window and you just see turbines in the water as far as the eye could see. Something, Adam, I've always been curious about is if you take a wind farm sort of off the shore and you take a wind farm on land, is are there statistics where you say an offshore wind is this much more in terms of efficient? And I can just picture, obviously the wind might tend to blow with less obstacles and restrictions offshore, and maybe that's the key thing, or maybe there are other environmental elements that are mitigated if you're offshore. So I could sort of logically start thinking about the benefits intuitively, but I'm just wondering, if you're comparing an offshore and an onshore, is there a huge difference, a bigger difference than maybe the layman would think?
I may be the lemon in this situation. I'll have to defer on that one and get back
Okay,
to you. Speak to some wind analysts that I'm close with, but I can't necessarily speak to the exact difference on it.
cool. No worries.
Yeah.
It's such a diversified area. Another topic that comes up globally, and I never know how to break it down. So I'm curious Wood Mackenzie's view on this, because essentially a few years ago, people on the line might have listened and heard and invested in a few years ago hydrogen. So if you were just looking at the performance of equities and companies and new listings, you might have thought that a bunch of cars are on the road right now and trucks, and there's a hydrogen delivery network around the corner, because you were seeing hundreds of percentage points of return, and maybe in some cases even more for some of these companies. But then soon after that, it's almost like the market hit the realization that, okay, wait a second. The physical world is not the software world. Hydrogen power does not proliferate with the speed of, say, Moore's Law, bringing down the cost of computation. And so as a result, we basically step back and say it's going to take some time. But that doesn't mean hydrogen is bad by any means. It just means that, okay, the market needs to come up with a more realistic timeline of how such a new energy technology is going to be deployed. And so if Adam, you're looking at hydrogen today, which I hear about it in the US, I heard about it in Europe, you hear about it in China. So all the world is sort of at least thinking about it. How do you see the hydrogen story unfolding as we ultimately move forward from here?
Yeah, that's it's a hot topic right now, right? And the hydrogen story, I'll kind of jump to the end of that story, and that we see it as necessary to reach net zero. And for a bit of clarification, that's not just net zero from power generation, that's just a net zero on carbon emissions. And so I think, and why I make that clarification is because we see hydrogen first really feeding into the industrial side, into refining, ammonia, green steel, big carbon emitting industries that can probably are going to be the first to adopt and use the advantages of hydrogen. Whereas its role within maybe the fuel cell or maybe power firing is a little bit further out. But right now, the big ask is it low carbon hydrogen or not? And so we have this green hydrogen um, manufactured, produced with clean energy, and the commercialization just isn't there right now. We're banking on a lot of technological advancements, and so I think that's why we saw such a boom in it with the past few years. A lot of interest because of all the potential it holds, but a lot is riding on those technical advancements. But there's also a lot going on still within the low carbon space on blue hydrogen. So with natural gas and carbon capture. And we're seeing a really exciting space, especially in the US for that with the IRA. US is going to be one of the most friendly as far as hydrogen policy goes. So if we're thinking about um, cheap natural gas from the US, cheap natural gas from Canada, electrolyzed and then shipped globally, it's looking to be far competitive compared to green hydrogen, and it's going to be an exciting story within the next 10 years to see kind of the technological advancements that allow that to kind of creep into not just the power sector, but really the industrial sector as well.
And as you're looking, because obviously we're talking about a lot of these new technologies, they don't, at least in many cases, exist at scale or at the scale that we would like them to exist, such that they would have a meaningful chance of helping us to reduce and get to that net zero goal. Um, you sort of step back and think, okay, and sometimes you see investors talking about, say, copper or cobalt or lithium, these various metals that are used in sort of different parts, different proportions, depending if we're talking about a battery, if we're talking about building a wind turbine, if we're talking about an electrolyzer. But at the end of the day, the overall destination is clear, and that is we need a lot more of these metals. And depending on the article you read and the day that you sort of open up the browser, um, there's a different thing about, oh, we're going to have a shortage of this, we're going to have a shortage of that. It might be nickel, it might be carbon, it might be that the world just doesn't realize how much more of these metals we're going to need. So, in one sense, you would say if people really bought into this story, the price of these metals should be just skyrocketing to the moon. But we don't necessarily immediately see that in prices. So, on the other hand, there might be similar to how there were new techniques used to get more natural gas and ultimately more oil. Maybe there are new techniques and things that could be used, or new sources that could be used to find more of these metals or substitute other metals that are easier to source. So I'm just curious how Wood Mackenzie, as someone who looks deeply at how these different materials are sourced, would sort of view some of these very necessary ingredients to the energy transition.
Yeah, totally. And just to mention that we have individual teams looking at each and every commodity. It's not like we have many generalists. It's we have a team looking just at copper. We have a team looking just at cobalt, just at lithium, and how that plays into the kind of global supply chain, be it energy transition or not. Um, and so, I mean, at the risks of making a generalist statement, I think the thing we're shortest on right now is investment within these metal spaces, especially within the battery side. Um, our reserve estimates are looking strong. To 2030, we're not necessarily seeing a reserve shortage, but what we're seeing is a need to invest within these metal spaces so that the finished and refined supply meets our demand picture. And at the same time, we're also going to need to see quite a large build out in the battery space and the renewable space to kind of justify this. So again, to use the word chicken and the egg, like that, it needs to happen together and coincides. And so, and kind of back to your question, you think about, I mean, mining is it's an old technique. You know, I'm a coal analyst, and just to kind of draw a parallel, coal's been mined very similarly in Appalachia for hundreds of years. And so in technology, yeah, it gets more efficient, but at the same day, getting a mined material out of the ground, um, we're not necessarily seeing a huge change in how that's done. But like you said, diversifying the types of materials we use is something that we see more of. One that comes to mind is sort of this hard rock lithium that we're seeing some projects pop up in California. Right now, we have virtually no domestic lithium supply in the U.S. We're reliant on our free trade agreement partners to reap the benefits of the IRA, but there's a lot of feasibility testing going um, on these hard rock sands. I think I'm saying that correctly with the lithium space, that would allow some pretty substantial lithium independence for the U.S. And so that's one that kind of comes to mind as far as this diversification, and kind of moving away from the lithium and lithium chemicals that we're seeing that are highly dependent on South America, Australia, and refineries in China.
And to that point, I know we've talked about it before, and I think the statistic was if the world said, and by the world I mean the Western world, the bloc of countries that seem, on certain issues anyway, to take issue with some of China's policies. If those countries, U.S. probably at the lead, said we don't want to have our electric vehicles supply chain, battery value chain going through China, at least anywhere to near the same extent. I think the statistic that you gave me in the past was it's possible to do that, but you can't snap your fingers and do it. It's something that you would have to have a concerted strategy and effort over, say, a 10-year period if you wanted to say onshore, because we're onshoring certain semiconductor capabilities, seemingly. So if we wanted to onshore certain battery processing capabilities, that would take roughly 10 years. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think 10 years is right, and something that we're seeing right now. So there's been a clarification made to the IRA within the past few months, that there was a bit of a gray area on what percentage of the value of the battery has to be sourced from where. Russia and China are out. That's still the same. Um, but what they're saying previously was that X% had to come from a free trade partner. That limits us on a few fronts. But now it's saying that X% of the value needs to come from a free trade partner or the US. And so to dive into that a little bit, let's say we get a mined material from Democratic Republic of the Congo, not a free trade partner, but not necessarily an entity of concern like China. And so with the refining, that adds value. So we buy the raw material from the Congo, but if it's refined and the value of refining is added within a free trade partner in the US, it can meet that 50% value from a free trade partner rule. It's a bit of an exemption that it really allows the mined source to be diversified as long as it's refined within a free trade partner or the US. And that's kind of where I'm going, is that that's where a big growth story is going to be within that 10-year period. It's not necessarily mining or sourcing from free trade partners or domestically. It's going to be refining those materials, adding that value to the final installation product. That's going to be a huge investment area for the U.S. That's where we're going to see a lot of things popping up within the next 10 years, reaping those benefits of the IRA, just strictly from the refining area and being able to source that material from essentially anywhere besides China. And that's where one of the biggest barriers is, because even though China only produces the graphite and refines the graphite that goes into these batteries, they're refining everything else. No matter where it's mined in the world, a huge percentage is being refined in China. So that if we can build out our refining infrastructure for these battery materials in the U.S., that's going to be a huge chunk and be really advantageous to the industry domestically. Big investment opportunity there.
Yeah, so it's sort of like the next chapter in energy independence in the sense that the world had its chapter of sort of the petro and the oil space, and the U.S. is certainly doing pretty well on that front. So now we're sort of now looking forward, saying, okay, when you get to that point where you need to supply, let's say, almost every new vehicle. Maybe we get there. I don't know, but almost every new vehicle or a majority share of new vehicles is electric. We're going to need a lot more batteries. Plus, we're going to need, like you said, the grid scale transmission and storage mechanisms as well. So something I'm just curious about is as Wood Mackenzie looks forward, are they seeing 10, 15 years out, and I know it's a tough thing to do to sort of forecast new technology, but you sort of think, okay, like we've been using lithium ion as the main technology for more than 30 years at this point. I think you had the camcorder in the early 90s, and that was one of the first instances where you could like take the battery off the camcorder, which was really big, and you're putting it in the thing and it can recharge. And so the science, the physics part of it is, like you were saying, probably not that different, even if they've been able to make it much more efficient and tailored to the particular needs and use cases. Um, do you think 10, 15 years from now, it's still lithium ion? Like lithium is just so much better at this than basically any other material? Or do you think we're going to get to a point where we're going to have this diverse array of materials, some of which people haven't even found yet? And at that future point, we may just be searching and looking for something totally different, even if, like you said today, it's these unique or new sources of lithium that might be generating the most interest.
Yeah, and it's such a hard question to answer, right? But it's something we're looking at really closely. I mean, we have PhDs in chemistry. We have folks who have worked within that battery space since the camcorder age, um, and for now it's lithium ion. But with I think you gave it there a 10 to 15. As we get closer to that 15, we're gonna we're gonna see a technological advancement. One, just because of natural secular motion, it's just bound to happen. But two, because of the investment and that's pouring into that space and the advancements that we're already seeing. Um, I mean, you hear a lot about these solid state batteries, right? That's kind of a hot button. When are the solid states going to be commercial? When are they going to come to scale? Um, and that because we get past that 10-year mark, it's hard to drop a pin on exactly when it's going to happen. But we're confident that it will happen. That the advancements we've seen in that solid state, that energy density, that energy longevity, the advantages it provides over a standard lithium ion battery um, are going to be big. And also, it's not like our lithium ion technology is going to stay the same now. It's not like the componentry that in the minerals that go into the different makeups of our various lithium ions are going to stay the same. That's also going to continue growing because it's what we have and it's what we're relying on. And if we're going to scale, and we're going to need to scale, and we're going to need to start scaling now, that's what we're going to have to depend on. We're going to have to make that better, kind of in conjunction with bringing on those new technologies like solid state.
Adam, I was just curious as you were mentioning solid state, if when you spoke to the experts at Wood Mackenzie in that area, if they'd ever sort of given you the sort of rough take in the sense that today, with the current technology, it takes a certain amount of time to charge the car, and a good range might be 350 miles. But if solid state was sort of the road of the future, like how much, if we're using the car as like a baseline, like are we charging the entire battery in like 10 minutes and the range is now 600 miles? Like what's the stepwise progression? I just asked because I'm personally curious on the difference between, say, what we're using today versus what a solid state battery would look like.
Yeah, I don't have an exact comparison. I think that just speaks to kind of how cloudy that technology is right now. One thing that does get talked about is that energy density, and so um, and that means is that we're gonna have a longer lasting battery, but also we're gonna have potentially a smaller battery, making these vehicles much more efficient. We don't, I mean, these EVs are extremely heavy right now, and so it's kind of these shrinking economies of scale as you add more batteries, the car gets heavier, and then it's kind of just powering the weight of the batteries at that point. And so what we're seeing with that solid state is going to be um, a much lighter, much more efficient car, or a possibly lighter. You know, that technology is just it's unclear what it will look like in its final form in an EV right now. But the potential for weight savings from an energy density standpoint is going to be it's going to be a big change. I wish I could put a number double triple on it, but I just don't have it off the top of my head right now.
No, and I mean the weight savings alone is some of the articles you read on the topic is people want to increase their range, and the smartest thing they can do is I know in North Carolina where I'm based, even if the speed limit says whatever it says, people are usually going 75, 80, and if they instead went 60, 65, that range is going to increase because like you said, you've got the weight. It's not a light vehicle, and you've also got the difference in wind resistance. These cars may not always be the most aerodynamic out there, and so yeah, range can be adjusted in many ways. Now, as we continue through here, I don't want to be remiss and completely leave out some of the other sources of renewable energy. There is a discussion of, say, nuclear, but it's a different discussion. It's not sort of the classic plant that looks the way it did in, say, 1970, with the giant smokestacks and all the rest. It's frequently termed the small modular reactors, and I was just wondering. I personally find that space interesting. I think it has to contribute something if we're going to get to net zero. But what's Wood Mackenzie's view on, say, the small modular nuclear reactors?
Yeah, I think you said it right. It's small, modular. It's localized. You know, it's no longer this massive large grid scale nuclear plant. If we're going to see more new capacity additions, it's going to be a smaller scale, and we do see a growth story. It's dwarfed a bit by what we see from your solar and wind renewable growth, but we do see growth in the long term globally. Um, I think that we've seen within the past 2 years, if we look, you mentioned France's nuclear fleet, and kind of the issues that they had over the last year. 2022, France's nuclear fleet was not performing well at all, and it was a huge contributor to the energy crisis that Europe saw. And I think that just kind of speaks to how important, as a baseload clean energy, nuclear is, and the potential we have there. I mean, with nuclear falling out of the drought and low hydro in Europe, we immediately saw, and of course the risk gas supplies coming out of Russia, we immediately saw a crisis. We saw coal prices fourfold the historical norm. We saw gas prices tenfold the historical norm. Just obscenities just because of these lesser known, not lesser known, but lesser talked about clean energy sources like hydro and nuclear, just because the lack of performance from them, there was a huge gap left. Even though they're not a huge baseload producer, if they're not running with as they're expected to, kind of as a constant, it's a big issue. It really speaks to the need there.
And the other topic, it comes up a lot, and it comes up sometimes in our recycling discussions or decarbonization discussions. This idea of biomass and even biogas, and it's something I have to admit I'm less personally familiar. But I think at the end of the day, if everything that you can put into the mix is going to help, because we've been talking about a diverse array of countries, a diverse array of markets. They're all going to have different levels of supply of different things. And if we're going to be economical here, and recognize that the price of certain inputs can massively increase. Like you had indicated, you never know when a country is going to invade another, like in the case of Russia and Ukraine last year, and that can obviously have an impact and an effect. So the more sources we have, the better off we might ultimately be. So when WoodMac is looking at biomass and biogas, what types of potential are you seeing there?
It's interesting, and I'm not extremely close to biomass. You think I would be as a coal analyst, but I was speaking with a client recently, and it sounds like to me a big barrier to this potential that biogas has, especially in Europe, is whether it's going to receive or be economic to receive carbon capture. That seems to be the the pivotal thing that the future of biogas is going to depend on. Um, if they're not going to get the investment for CCUS install, it's going to be a difficult growth story there. It's going to be a necessary implementation, and I think that what needs to happen there, um, when you compare someone looking to invest into CCUS, in gas versus biomass, they may see a longer and larger growth story or more sustained story on the gas side. But with government intervention, and some incentive there to install those CCUs onto biomass, there is definitely potential there. I think the growth story right now in our base case is flat to positive, not massive, but with potential to grow if widespread CCUs are implemented. I mean, and like you said, this over the past few years, we've the the talks of energy flexibility and security have become priority number one, in having a scalable baseload power, a thermal generating power, is important, as we saw when things go wrong in the market.
Now, something I wonder about. I hear about it on certain podcasts sometimes, not widespread, and I think it's used in Iceland, but I admittedly don't know if it's used anywhere else. This idea of geothermal, this idea that there's obviously, if you go deep enough down, there's a lot of heat within the Earth's crust. We see it when volcanoes erupt. There are sort of rocks that have been molten and melted down. They're obviously quite hot, but at the end of the day, if there's a way to productively harness that heat, and most of our power generation these days, it's either heat or it's motion that's used. And if you harness that heat and you create steam and you get a turbine spinning, away you go. You've got a source of electricity, and I don't think that stuff under the Earth's crust is going to be cooling down anytime soon, and it's not releasing any carbon, to my knowledge. So if we could access it, it sounds intriguing. It sounds interesting. Maybe Iceland, because it is able to do this, is maybe energy independent as an island sitting out there, which is kind of an interesting case in itself. But I'm personally just curious if WoodMac looks at all at the geothermal area.
We do, yeah. We're full coverage. I don't know them personally, but I'm positive that we have and at least a few experts on geothermal within our teams. So I'm not very close to that, so I can't speak too much to the geothermal side. But I mean, you think about it as one of those emerging technologies, something that has potential but doesn't get put in the spotlight right now because you don't see it coming to scale and commercialization like we do compared to other renewable sources. Um, but yeah, that's one to follow up on for me, definitely.
Yeah, it's crystal clear when you look at the headline distribution, when you look at all the various charts that are out there that tell us what's going on in the space. And we spent the most time on it. It's basically wind, solar, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and then small sprinklings of some of this other stuff gets mixed in, but nowhere near. It seems as though the world has said we're on a path, and wind and solar are the main components of that path. That's how we believe we're going to be moving forward. So, in the final question I wanted to ask Adam today, because at the end of the day, what we're building towards here is this idea of being carbon neutral, this idea of a net zero impact. We're probably very far away from that. So we've talked about all these technologies. We've talked about how some governments more than others are trying to inspire actions in various ways to try to get on that path. I know people throw out we need to be at a certain place by 2030, which gets us to a certain place by 2050. I think China has said they're trying to get to a certain place by 2060. But in the end, as WoodMac looks at the full picture of available information today, what do you think our chances are of actually getting that net zero, which everybody always sort of talks about in the background?
It's about when, right? And we run so many scenarios that make it seem more feasible or not. I think generally speaking, the targets that we see, like from Repower EU, are lofty, based off of what we see available now. I think it's like a 70% by 2030. We're around 45 right now. Um, we can see it above 60. We can see it above 65, but the amount of I think it depends on a lot of technological advancement. We're gonna have to see a lot of economies of scale. We're gonna have to see costs come way down, or we're gonna have to see very strong lines drawn in the sand on carbon. Um, and so like an immediate phase out of coal, um, immediate implementation of carbon capture, um, until renewables can meet demand. Demand is not going to stop growing. We see a steady demand growth, and demand isn't elastic anymore. It is very difficult to change human behavior from a power use standpoint. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a very difficult path to net zero. It is not impossible. Um, but I think the key things we need to see is stronger policy, a ton of investment, into the renewables and storage spaces, especially the storage space. I think that's a really interesting one, the one that I'm fairly close um, to make this scalable. If we're looking at the technologies we have right now, we're going to need to see a lot of investment into the storage space, the transmission and interconnection space, to we can make the technology we have now more widespread. But I think to meet that net zero, we have to take a step away from the power industry and think about industry. It's steel making, refining. Um, those industries are going to have to get on board as well, and we're going to need to see stronger incentives there, more government intervention if we're going to meet net zero. Um, and of course, more technological advancement. It's not just as easy as replacing met coal with hydrogen in a coke plant or a steel plant to make steel. It's not an easy swap. We're going to need to have investment into that space to see growth. We're going to need to see those solid state batteries come online to make things more efficient. It's we're going to need to investment. It's driving investment, driving technology, um, and government policy for driving that investment, I guess, is one way to put it.
Absolutely. We spend a lot of similar to how in the energy space we spend a lot of time on wind and solar. We tend to generally spend a lot of time on electric vehicle adoption and power generation. But you take something like concrete, you mentioned steel. We did not talk about farming, but that's another one. If the idea is we have these greenhouse gases that lead to a warming of the planet, a warming of the climate, and we want to mitigate that impact, power generation and vehicles and energy storage are important. But like you're indicating, it's certainly not the full picture. But I think we've taken as long as we can, or traveled as far as we can within 60 minutes. So I want to thank Adam Woods from Wood Mackenzie for offering a diverse array of views on many topics. It's impossible to be fully up to date on every single one, but it's amazing to see what Wood Mackenzie can kind of bring to such an array of different things. And I want to thank as well the audience for dialing in, tuning in, streaming our third episode of The Next Big Thing. As I said at the beginning, I am Chris Gennady. And if you're liking the podcast, don't hesitate to recommend it to someone or to leave a rating. Other than that, take care. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much, Chris.